Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 188, and it's titled Regenerative Properties. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a Commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Ruby Weapon over on Reddit, and that card is Soldevi Steam Beast. And Soldevi Steam Beast is 5 mana for an artifact. It's a 4/2, and whenever it becomes tapped, target opponent gains 2 life, and you can pay 2 and regenerate it. And so a quick reminder, regenerate, since the reminder text is not on the card, basically just means that the next time this creature would be destroyed, instead you tap it. So the idea is we can save it for 2 mana, but if we save it, then an opponent's going to gain 2 life. And I'm not going to lie to you, when this card was first suggested, I knew I had to build around it because my first thought was, how in the world do we build around this card? And I love finding cards that really make me question how to build a deck. So without any more explanation there, we're going to move on to the commander and we'll kind of start to piece things together. So this week, I of course got to add some colors to it. We're not a colorless deck this week. We are instead an Abzan deck playing with Teneb the Harvester. So Teneb is 3 black, green, white for a 6/6 legendary creature dragon. It's got flying, and whenever Teneb deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 and a black. If you do, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, Teneb doesn't have a ton to do with the themes of our deck. He's mostly just here for the colors and because I like Teneb. He's kind of cool. It's a commander that I don't really get the chance to use very often. But unfortunately, he's not essential to the game plan. And that's because as we move into our themes, our first major game plan is actually going to be Regenerate. We are playing as many Regenerate creatures as possible, and obviously Teneb doesn't have Regenerate, and there really isn't a great commander that has Regenerate. Yeah, there's things like Thrun the Last Troll, but we really wanted to make sure we had more than just green. And so a good example of some of our Regenerate creatures are right here with Horned Troll, which is 2 and a green for a 2/2 troll, and it just has pay 1 green, Regenerate Horned Troll. So there are a ton of Regenerate creatures in Magic, and even though Magic's kind of moved away from that in recent years, a lot of those cards tend to be pretty expensive to regenerate. They tend to be a lot more than we want to be paying. So this deck specifically focuses in on creatures that have a regenerate cost of 2 mana or less. And specifically, we tried to focus on 1 mana, and there's even some that have free regenerate costs, or quote-unquote free, meaning maybe we just pay some life. But either way, that is the bulk of what we're trying to do this week. And the nice thing about having so many regenerate creatures means that when we look at theme number 2, which is board wipes, we can protect ourselves while kind of hindering whatever our opponents are doing. So a very easy way to understand this is with Day of Judgment, which is 2 white for a sorcery that simply says destroy all creatures. Now, there are some board wipes that you're going to want to avoid with this deck. For example, there's a lot of board wipes that say destroy all creatures. They can't be regenerated. Obviously, we're trying to avoid that, so Wrath of God, Damnation, not in here. We don't want those. So instead, if we can focus on destroying all the creatures, we can wipe away what our opponents are doing and then regenerate our own creatures, so it's essentially just a one-sided board wipe. And yes, it does wind up being a little bit more expensive, because even just a Day of Judgment to keep our Horned Troll means we're spending 5 mana on the wipe instead of just 4, and that can get expensive. But I do think it's worth it when you consider that most one-sided board wipes tend to be 7+ mana. Making it 5 or 6 is not quite a deal breaker. And then of course, moving into our final theme of the deck, this one is going to be Ramp. As I mentioned, this deck is very mana intensive. Even with all of our creatures having 1 or 2 mana regenerate costs, we still need a ton of mana to be able to keep our board after a board wipe, so we need to make sure we're getting as many lands in play as possible, and to that end we have cards like Roiling Regrowth, which is 2 and a green for an instant. We sacrifice a land, search our library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So we have your traditional ramp package, being able to search lands out of our deck and put them into play, but we also have a couple of ways to double the mana that our deck would produce, because we want to make sure that we have so much mana at any given time that our board is always going to be safe. Because if we have to pick and choose which of our creatures to keep, which ones we're regenerating, then we start to lose some of our board presence, and we need to make sure that we're keeping it. Because if we're being perfectly honest, regenerate creatures tend to be a little bit behind the curve when it comes to power level. We already talked about Horn Troll. That's a 3 mana 2/2 in green, so, they're not that powerful. We need to find ways to make them better, and that is why Regenerate needs to always be active. But those are our major themes for this deck. And the next thing I want to do is take a look at some of the key cards in this deck. Make sure that we are still finding ways to accrue value and find our win conditions. And these are the cards that, while they're not the most important cards to the deck, they are some of the most important cards to the deck, and that is what makes them, well, our key cards. So our very first key card is going to be Grim Gigantosaurus. And this looks a little bit weird on the face, but Grim Gigantosaurus is 5 black-green for a 10/10 dinosaur, and it has Monstrosity 10 for 10 black-green, but this ability costs 1 less to activate for each creature with power 4 or greater your opponent's control, so it is possible that we can get this down to just a single black and a green. And when Grim Gigantosaurus becomes monstrous, destroy all artifacts and creatures other than Grim Gigantosaurus. So essentially, what we want to be doing with this is using it as 7 mana, get a 10/10, which is pretty solid, it's pretty decent, but then it becomes hopefully a 2 mana board wipe, and we can regenerate our creatures through that board wipe, making it a 2 mana board wipe, and then, maybe 5 mana on top of that, we'll say, for regenerate. So all of a sudden, we're paying 7 mana for a one-sided board wipe that leaves us with a 20/20 creature that is still able to attack because it's not tapping itself, it's not destroying itself, and it deals with a lot of other stuff on the board that we may not be able to deal with otherwise, like the artifacts and maybe some other creatures that can outpace all of our regenerate creatures. So Grim Gigantosaurus being a board wipe on a creature that is possibly very cheap is incredibly effective for what we want to be doing, and it gives us a huge threat that we can use to close out the game. Our next key card is going to be Hunted Troll, which is probably the best regenerate creature in our entire deck. It is 2 green for an 8/4 Troll Warrior. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent puts 4 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield, and you can pay a green to regenerate it. The Hunted cycle in general is usually a very good set of cards to be playing in Commander, because unlike one-on-one Magic, this gives you a chance to kind of make a friend in the game. We get to play an 8/4 for 4 mana, and then we get to give someone else 4 1/1 fairies. And yeah, they could eventually attack us with those fairies, but ideally we'll be in a situation where we can give it to someone who may be behind, or maybe someone who's not the arch enemy at the table, and we can kind of work together to take down whoever's in the lead. And then at the end of it, we still have our Hunted Troll, which is capable of defeating the 4 fairies because we can regenerate it. So that gives us a bit of an edge and helps us make a friend, which I genuinely believe is often underrated in Commander. Being able to give your opponents things usually tends to work out in your favor. And then, leading into our final key card of the deck, this one takes a little bit of explaining, so bear with me. That is Throne of the God Pharaoh. So Throne of the God Pharaoh, 2 mana for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So typically you find this in decks that want to be very aggressive and always attacking, so that way their creatures are always turned sideways. And that is a main reason we have it in the deck. But the other main reason is because the wording on Regenerate is if the creature would be destroyed, you tap it instead. So we could actually cast Throne of the God Pharaoh, have it in play with all of our Regenerate creatures, cast a board wipe, regenerate our team, and even though we couldn't attack because they're now tapped, they are still going to trigger Throne of the God Pharaoh at the end of turn and drain out our opponents, possibly for 5, 6, 7, maybe more every single turn if we can keep turning them sideways. And then if we've wiped the board, we now probably have a pretty open avenue for attack on the next turn. So this can really snowball out of control, and Throne of the God Pharaoh is definitely the biggest non-combat win condition in the deck, so it definitely earns a spot in our key cards. Now, moving on though from our key cards, we're going to get into some cool interactions, and these are cards that synergize very well with each other, and in some cases are just kind of fun cards that I want to highlight in the deck because they don't really get the love that they deserve. So this first cool interaction is going to be between Final Showdown and Wrap in Vigor. So Final Showdown is a very unique card for this deck, but it's actually pretty important. It's a single white mana, technically, for an instant that has Spree, so we can choose one or more additional costs. For an additional 1, all creatures lose all abilities until end of turn. I would highly recommend you not do that unless absolutely necessary, because that does remove Regenerate from our creatures. You can spend 1, choose a creature you control, it gains indestructible until the end of turn, and, the most important aspect, for 5, you can destroy all creatures. So this is a 6 mana, instant speed board wipe. And if we want to save our own creatures with Regenerate, that's obviously going to be very expensive because it's 6 mana just to wipe the board, and then we also have to pay their Regenerate costs. So instead, we can use Wrap in Vigor, which is 1 and a green for an instant, that simply says regenerate each creature you control. So for a massive 8 mana, which I know is not exactly the easiest amount to come by, we can completely one-sided board wipe our opponents, but we can do it at instant speed, which is incredibly rare. And it's something that can actively just win us the game. Because if we do this at the end of an opponent's turn, we are able to untap all of our creatures immediately, none of our opponents have any creatures, and then we can just smack them for as much as we need to, and just immediately win the game. Well, maybe not immediately, but you kind of get what I'm saying. So Final Showdown and Wrap in Vigor, again, very expensive to use together, 8 mana is a lot, but we do have a ton of ramp, we have a ton of mana doublers, and this is an easy way for us to close out games. Moving on though, to our next cool interaction, this one is going to be between Mortivore and Lotleth Troll. We don't have a huge graveyard theme for this deck, but we do expect our creatures to die sometimes, because even if they maybe can't regenerate, maybe there's something like a Wrath of God effect, there's also the option that we just might not have enough mana to regenerate all of our creatures. And so Mortivore and Lotleth Troll are kind of our way of getting around that. So Mortivore is 2 black for a star Lurgoyf. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards, and we can pay a black to regenerate it. Ideally, this is something that's going to be relevant throughout the course of the game because we're going to be casting board wipes, we're going to be destroying a ton of creatures, our creatures may also be dying, so Mortivore could be very large, and it's very easy to regenerate it. But if we don't have a great way to make it bigger with our board wipes, we can always use Lotleth Troll, which is a black and a green for a 2/1 zombie troll. It's got trample. We can discard a card, specifically a creature card, to put a +1/+1 counter on Lotleth Troll, and we can pay a black to regenerate it. So if we are attacking with both of these creatures, all we have to do is discard a single creature, and we're going to pump both of their power and toughness by 1 each. So if we just happen to have a bunch of creatures in our hand we don't necessarily need, or we're attacking someone who thinks they might be safe, they decide not to block, we can just kind of fill up our own graveyard and hit somebody for a ton of damage out of nowhere, and then we still have the mana to regenerate them because the ability to discard with Lotleth Troll is completely free. We don't have to pay for it, we can just discard cards. So that is a at least kind of cool interaction. I know it's a little bit weird considering we're not really a graveyard deck, but we're playing into the fact that our stuff is probably gonna die. And then, of course, on the other side, we do still have Teneb in the command zone, so we can reanimate some of the things we throw away in the future. But those are all of our cool interactions for this deck, and the next thing we got to do is take a look at the price of this deck. So this week, our total deck price came out to $51.75, and a decent portion of that actually comes from Debt of Loyalty, which is 1 white for an instant that says regenerate target creature, gain control of that creature. Now, it is worth mentioning that this is not just you target a creature and immediately gain control of it. The creature does have to regenerate before you can gain control of it. So this is something that you want to cast in response to maybe combat, you want to cast it in response to a board wipe or a removal spell, but 3 mana at instant speed in white is a pretty efficient way to gain control of a creature. And yes, it's going to be tapped when you gain control of it because it just regenerated. That means that we are able to use this in a way to get a huge threat off of the board and get it back on our side. So I do think Debt of Loyalty is worth the $9.72, but if you're worried about the price of it, you can always trim it down. There are a ton of regenerate creatures that we were not able to fit into the deck, so you can replace it with something like that and drop the price down to almost $40, which is pretty efficient. Not super cheap, but it's not super expensive either, so I do think that that could be worth it. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I have a suggestion for you there as well. And we've already talked about mana doublers, but one thing we couldn't include was a mana tripler. So Nyx Bloom Ancient is 4 green for a 5/5 elemental. It's got trample. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. Because this deck is so mana hungry, getting a way to triple our mana is pretty effective at keeping all of our creatures alive. And unfortunately, Nyx Bloom Ancient does not regenerate on its own, so it would die to our board wipes or maybe combat or removal spells, but I do still think it's worth it, especially if you can drop it when you still have a couple of mana open, because it turns your 2 open mana now into 6, which is going to mean you're able to regenerate pretty much your entire board at that rate. Now, as always, if you're putting a card into the deck, you do have to take a card out of the deck, and the card that I would recommend taking out is Dragon Scarred Bear, which is 2 and a green for a 3/2 bear. It has Formidable, so for 1 and a green you can regenerate Dragon Scarred Bear, but only if creatures you control have total power 8 or greater. And this is a weird card to recommend taking out because it is a regenerate creature. It's pretty low on the mana curve, but there aren't a ton of very strong regenerate creatures. Most of our creatures tend to fall in as 1/1s, 2/2s, maybe 3/3s if we're lucky. So having total power 8 or greater is actually a pretty big ask for this deck. We really want to win the game through a war of attrition, just kind of slowly beating down our opponents, wiping away their boards so they can't do anything, and continuing it on. So expecting us to get 8 power is kind of tough sometimes, and we don't really want a regenerate creature that requires us to have other creatures, because then it just dies to board wipes or removal or combat. So it's really not what we're looking for. I do think Dragon Scarred Bear can be very good, I just don't know if this is quite the deck for it. So with all of that being said, we're going to move on now to a game with this deck. We got to see how it performs, we got to see what Regenerate can actually do. However, before we get to that, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But you can also find us over on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member, where any additional support gets you some amazing benefits, things like getting the deck lists a week early, things like access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel. You get the guarantee from me that any card you suggest will be turned into a video eventually. Might take me a while because I do tend to work pretty far in advance. And then of course, other things like getting a card shipped to you and a bunch of other cool stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, please do check us out. All support really does help, even the likes and the subscribes, so if it's not your time, I completely understand. But if you'd like to join the amazing people listed below, you can always get a shout out. And speaking of shoutouts, a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, and Jakar. So thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's check out this week's game. So as always, we are joined by 3 opponents this week. Our first opponent is Bilal playing Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest. Then we have Cow playing Magnus the Red. And finally we have Doodle playing Saravok Deathbringer and Raised by Giants. So starting off with Bilal's Dragonhawk deck, this is kind of exactly what it looks like. This is mono red, beefy creatures. He just wants to have a ton of creatures with power 4 or greater, exile some cards, do some damage, and just kind of pressure his opponent's life totals throughout the course of the game. I personally am a huge fan of Dragonhawk. I think that burn and that kind of style is a little bit underrepresented in Commander and can still be very strong. So I like that Dragonhawk is providing both card advantage and burn. So I'm very excited to see what it can do, but I won't lie, I am very nervous because I expect it to be quite the strong deck. Moving on to Cow's Magnus deck, this is a deck that we've seen on the channel before, but it didn't quite get to do what it wanted to do. So essentially this is a Spellslinger deck that focuses on making tokens, so that way he can make his spells even cheaper, since every instant and sorcery costs 1 less for each creature token he controls. So this is another deck that I am very concerned about at the table because I know how strong Izzet Spellslinger can be. And I imagine even something as simple as a Talrand or a young Pyromancer that's able to churn out tokens every single turn is just going to get this deck so far out of control that there's not going to be anything the rest of us can do. So I do think that out of all the decks at the table, that's probably the one I'm the most worried about. But if I'm being perfectly honest this week, they are all a concern. And speaking of more concerns at the table, we do have Doodle with his Saravok and Raised by Giants deck. So Saravok wants to do damage to each opponent if a permanent didn't leave the battlefield on their turn. And then Raised by Giants is going to make Saravok a 10/10, so each opponent would lose 10 life at the end of their turn. This is a deck that has shown up again on the channel before. It is essentially like a Turbo Fog deck. He kind of wants to lock the game down so that his opponents can't do too much, meaning that they are forced to take the damage from Saravok and Raised by Giants, and he can just kind of drain people out of the game over the course of 2 or 3 turns. So this is, once again, a deck that I am concerned about because one of our main win conditions is combat, and if we can't push through damage, then there's not much we can do. We'll kind of have to rely on getting Throne of the God Pharaoh, and since it's a 1-of, we may or may not get it. But either way, I think this game is going to be a ton of fun. I am a huge fan of all of these decks, even though I am scared of all of these decks. So let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner. Get those predictions in, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Cow, Doodle, and then myself. On Bilal's turn, he plays a mountain. Cow plays a mountain. Doodle plays a Path of Ancestry. I play a Plains. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Invasion of Mercadia, choosing me to defend it, then discards a card and draws 2 when it enters. Cow plays an island and casts Star Compass. Doodle plays a Woodland Chasm. I play a Selesnya Sanctuary, returning a Plains to my hand. Bilal casts a Tablet of Completion, tapping it to put an oil counter on it. Cow plays a mountain, then casts Arcane Signet, and also casts Jace's Sanctum, making his instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, and letting him scry 1 whenever he casts an instant or sorcery. Doodle plays a forest and casts Glade Muse, letting any player draw a card when they cast a spell and it's not their turn. I cast a Sakura Tribe Elder, then play Sand Steps Citadel. Unfortunately, on Bilal's turn, he's still missing his 3rd land drop, so he simply passes. Cow plays a thriving Isle, naming Red, so it taps for both of his colors, then casts his commander, Magnus the Red, making his instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast for each token he controls, and also making a 3/3 spawn token whenever Magnus deals combat damage to an opponent. Doodle plays a Wastes and casts his commander Saravok Deathbringer, making any player lose life in their end step equal to Saravok's power, which is currently 3, unless a permanent left the battlefield that turn. This means Doodle loses 3 life in his end step. I play a Plains, attack Bilal for 1 with Sakura Tribe Elder, then sacrifice it to search my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. In my second main phase, I cast Mischievous Poltergeist, which can be regenerated if I pay a life. Then at the end of turn, Bilal puts another oil counter on his tablet, now letting it tap for a colorless mana. On Bilal's turn, he cast Burnished Heart and loses 3 life in his end step from Saravok. Cow plays a Training Center and attacks Doodle for 3 with Magnus, creating a spawn token when it deals damage. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Forest and casts Culling Ritual, destroying all non-land permanents with mana value 2 or less, and letting Doodle make a green or black mana for each permanent destroyed, which is 5, letting him cast a Seedborn Muse, untapping all his permanents in each other player's untap step. Before combat, Cow casts Chaos Warp, scrying 1, drawing a card and shuffling Seedborn Muse into Doodle's deck, letting him reveal the top card of his library and put it into play if it's a permanent, but he reveals Soul's Majesty so it stays on top instead. Once that's resolved, Doodle attacks Cow for 5 with both of his creatures, and before blocks, Cow casts Solemnity Vision, scrying 1, drawing a card and looking at the top 6 cards of his library, revealing an instant or sorcery from among them, specifically Rite of Replication, putting it into his hand. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast Ancient Silverback, which can regenerate for 1 green mana, then I lose 3 life in my end step. Bilal plays a Mountain and sacrifices his Burnished Heart to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Cow plays an Island and attacks Doodle for 3 with Magnus, making another spawn token. Then in his second main phase, Cow casts Talrand the Sky Summoner, now making a 2/2 Drake token whenever he casts an instant or sorcery spell. Then he also casts Rite of Replication, creating a token copy of Ancient Silverback, scrying 1 and making another Drake. At the end of turn, Cow loses 3 life. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Nurturing Peatland, sacrificing it to draw a card. On my turn, I play an Exotic Orchard and cast Moss Bridge Troll, which is regenerated when it would be destroyed, and lets me tap any number of creatures with power 10 or greater to give it +20/+20 until the end of turn. Then at the end of my turn, I lose 3 life. Bilal plays a Mountain, casts a Gilded Lotus, then casts Pain Distributor, letting each player make a treasure token whenever they cast their first spell each turn, and doing 1 damage to an opponent whenever an artifact goes to their graveyard from the battlefield. Then at the end of turn, Bilal loses 3. Cow plays an Island and casts Treasure Cruise, delving away 4 cards from his graveyard, scrying 1, making a Drake token, making a treasure token, and drawing 3 cards. He then attacks Doodle for 6 with the Ape, Bilal for 3 with Magnus, and me for 2 with a Drake. Before the damage, Doodle casts Blunt the Assault, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, and gaining 12 life since there are 12 creatures in play, also drawing a card and making a treasure. In his second main phase, Cow casts Wizards of Thay, which has Myriad, makes his instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, and lets him cast sorceries as though they had flash. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Tower of the Magistrate and casts his background Raised by Giants, making his commander a 10/10 and making another treasure token. Then after that, he casts Elvish Reclaimer. On my turn, I cast Cudgel Troll, which can regenerate for a green mana, making me a treasure token. Then I attack Doodle for 5 with Moss Bridge Troll, but he blocks with the Glade Heart, killing it and taking no damage. Before the damage though, Cow cast Rally the Horde, scrying 1, drawing a card, making a Drake, and making a treasure token, then exiling the top 3 cards of his library. If the last card exiled isn't a land, he repeats this process until the last card exiled is a land, then makes a 1/1 warrior token for each non-land exiled this way. This ends with him exiling 18 cards and making 13 warrior tokens. In my second main phase, I cast a Chilling Apparition, which can be regenerated for a black mana. On Bilal's turn, he casts Terror of the Peaks, making a treasure token and doing damage to any target equal to the power of any creature that enters under his control. After that, he casts his commander Dragonhawk, Fate's Tempest, exiling the top 2 cards of his library, since he controls 2 creatures with power 4 or greater, being able to play them until his next end step, and doing 2 damage to each opponent in his end step for each card still exiled this way. Since Dragonhawk entered the battlefield, this triggers the Terror of the Peaks, doing 5 damage to my Silverback, but I regenerate it. Finally, in Bilal's end step, Dragonhawk deals 4 damage to each of his opponents. Cow plays a Mountain and attacks me for 6 with his Silverback, and attacks Doodle for 13 with his Warriors. I block with the Poltergeist, paying a life to regenerate it, while Doodle blocks 2 of the Warriors, killing them and taking 11. On Doodle's turn, he casts Soul's Majesty, drawing cards equal to the power of target creature he controls, choosing Saravok, which has 10 power. In response, Cow casts Comet Storm for X equals 16 and multi-kicked 8 times, letting him do 16 damage to 8 different targets, hitting Doodle, Bilal, myself, Saravok, Dragonhawk, Terror of the Peaks, my Silverback, and Cudgel Troll, killing all the creatures targeted. Before that can resolve though, Doodle activates Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a land to search his library for a land, putting into play tapped. This lets him get Glacial Chasm, forcing him to sacrifice a land when it enters but preventing all damage that would be done to him, and making him pay a cumulative upkeep of 2 life to keep it around. Then the Comet Storm resolves, but Doodle's Soul Majesty fizzles, preventing him from drawing any cards. Once all of that has resolved, Doodle plays an Overgrown Tomb tapped. On my turn, I cast a Darkling Stalker, which can be regenerated for a black mana, and can get +1/+1 until the end of turn, also for a black mana. This makes me a treasure, then I attack Doodle for 1, completely forgetting he just put Glacial Chasm into play, so he takes no damage. In my second main phase, I cast Dragon's Scarred Bear, which can regenerate for 2. Bilal plays a Mountain and casts Mana Geyser, making a red mana for each tapped land his opponents control, which is 20. But he also cast Reverberate, copying Mana Geyser, so he gets a grand total of 40 red mana. Once that's resolved, he casts Udvara Hellkite, making a 6/6 dragon token whenever a dragon he controls attacks. He casts Lelia, the Blade Reforged, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he exiles a card from his library. He also casts There and Back again, preventing Wizards of Thay from blocking this turn, and finally Bilal recasts his commander Dragonhawk, exiling 2 cards from the top of his library when it enters, specifically a Mountain and a Vandal Blast, which lets him cast and overload Vandal Blast, destroying all artifacts his opponents control, and, thanks to Pain Distributor, doing 1 damage to me and 2 to Cow. Bilal then attacks Doodle with Lelia, exiling Guildless Commons from the top of his library, but doing no damage due to Glacial Chasm. Then at the end of turn, Bilal mistakenly triggers Dragonhawk again, exiling 3 mountains from the top of his library, putting a counter on Lelia and doing 6 damage to Cow and myself. On Cow's turn, he plays an island and attacks Bilal for 12 with his warrior tokens, and attacks Doodle with the Wizards of Thay, but Bilal blocks 2 warriors and the Myriad token, while I also block the token coming my way, killing the tokens while Bilal takes 10. In Doodle's upkeep, he puts a counter on Glacial Chasm and pays 2 life for cumulative upkeep, then activates Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a forest to search his library for a land, specifically Field of the Dead, putting it into play tapped. This lets him create a 2/2 zombie token whenever a land enters under his control, as long as he controls 7 lands with different names. Once that's resolved, he plays Terramorphic Expanse, making a zombie, and sacrifices it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped and making another zombie. I play a swamp and cast my commander, Teneb the Harvester, making a treasure token. In Bilal's upkeep, his Saga moves to lore counter 2, letting him search his library for a mountain, putting it into play tapped. Then he casts Inferno of the Star Mounts and attacks Doodle with Lelia and the Hellkite, exiling Thrill of Possibility from the top of his library, putting a counter on Lelia, and making a 6/6 dragon token. Since Doodle still has the Glacial Chasm though, he takes no damage. On Cow's turn, he simply plays a mountain, then passes. In Doodle's upkeep, he puts another counter on Glacial Chasm and loses 4 life, then plays a Rogue's Passage, making a zombie token. I cast Cultivate, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into my hand, making a treasure. Then I play a Forest and cast Sentry of the Underworld, which can be regenerated for 2 mana and 3 life. At the start of Bilal's turn, he puts the final lore counter on There and Back again, sacrificing it and creating a token copy of Smog. After that, he casts Karlach, Fury of Avernus, so whenever he attacks for the first time each turn, he untaps all attacking creatures, gives them first strike, then gets an additional combat step. After that, he attacks Doodle with Lelia and me for 6 with a dragon token, giving them first strike, untapping them, getting an additional combat step, making another dragon token, and exiling a mountain from the top of his library, putting another counter on Lelia. I block with the Poltergeist, paying a life to regenerate it. Then in Bilal's second main phase, he attacks Doodle with Lelia and the dragon token, making another dragon, exiling another mountain from the top of his library, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Lelia. Then in his second main phase, he plays a mountain and passes. Cow plays an island, and at the end of turn, Doodle activates Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a swamp to search his library for a land, specifically Temple of Malady, putting it into play tapped, scrying 1 and making a zombie. Then, in Doodle's upkeep, he puts a counter on Glacial Chasm and pays 6 life for cumulative upkeep. He plays a Forest, making another zombie token, and activates Elvish Reclaimer again, sacrificing Tower of the Magistrate to search his library for a land, in this case Golgari Rot Farm, putting it into play tapped and returning Glacial Chasm to his hand, and making another zombie. On my turn, I cast Mirari's Wake, letting my lands tap for an additional mana, and giving all my creatures +1/+1. I then attack Doodle for 11 with Teneb and the Sentry of the Underworld, but he casts Terrifying Presence, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures other than Elvish Reclaimer. Bilal moves straight to combat, attacking Doodle with Lelia and 3 dragon tokens, making 3 more dragons, exiling a mountain, putting a +1/+1 counter on Lelia, untapping all his attacking creatures, giving them first strike, and getting an additional combat phase. Before damage, Doodle cast Fog of War, preventing all damage that would be dealt by creatures power 3 or less, and gaining a life for each creature in play, which is 48. Before that can resolve though, Bilal activates Inferno of the Star Mounts 14 times, giving it +14/+0, putting its power to 20, and triggering its ability to do 20 damage to any target, doing 20 to Doodle, knocking him out of the game. For his second combat, Bilal attacks me with 2 dragon tokens and attacks Cow with the rest of his board, making 6 more dragon tokens, exiling a mountain, getting a +1/+1 counter on Lelia, and on attacks, Dragonhawk also triggers, but Cow responds before Bilal can exile the cards, casting Curse of Swine for X equals 27, exiling all creatures his opponents control and 9 of his warriors, replacing them with 2/2 pigs. Unfortunately, since this is an exile effect, I can't even regenerate my creatures, and Bilal loses all of his creatures, so the Dragonhawk trigger does nothing. However, Cow still makes a Drake and a treasure. In his second main phase, Bilal casts Mishra's Bauble, sacrificing it to look at the top card of Cow's library and draw a card in the next upkeep. On Cow's turn, he casts Ral Is It Viceroy, activating his +1 ability to look at the top 2 cards of his library, putting one into his hand and the other into his graveyard, then plays an island and attacks me with Wizards of Thay and 9 pigs, then also attacks Bilal with Magnus, 4 drakes, Ancient Silverback, and a Spawn. Before the blocks, Cow also casts Girad's Belligerence for X equals 25, doing 25 damage divided as he chooses among any number of target creatures and populating for each creature that dies this way. This allows him to kill all of his opponent's creatures except for 4 of my pigs, and in response, Bilal cast Wild Magic Surge, destroying one of my pigs and letting me reveal cards from the top of my deck until I reveal a creature, putting it into play. Unfortunately, that only finds me a Horned Troll, which isn't enough to save us, so damage happens, with Cow doing 10 damage to me even through blocks, and 20 damage to Bilal, knocking us both out, and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on. I think that over the course of the game, every deck kind of got to do what it wanted to do. Even though Bilal got a little bit mana screwed at the beginning, he was able to claw his way back in. He was able to get a ton of dragons, and we were able to see some really cool synergies out of his deck, including, of course, the Mana Geyser for 40 mana, which was wild, being able to dump his entire hand. But definitely a cool showing by Bilal's deck, and I think that the knocking out of Doodle with the Inferno of the Star Mounts was a very unique interaction and happened at a very specific time, because there's a pretty solid chance Doodle just wins the game if that resolves, so very, very cool. Moving on to Cow, our winner, so a huge shout out to Cow. I think that the Magnus deck performed incredibly well, even though he was very much stuck on lands, or I suppose not stuck on lands, it'd be the opposite, flooded by lands, because every single turn he's top decking, he had no cards in his hand, he's drawing a land almost every single turn, and then eventually we get to the end of the game, he's able to find a couple of other key cards that he can kind of string together, get some tokens, get some synergies, get some damage, and it allowed him to just barely clutch up the victory. So very, very cool win by Cow. Moving on to Doodle, I think that Doodle really had that game locked up with the Glacial Chasm. I think that if he had not played a forest on his last turn and instead got it in the bounce land to bounce back the Glacial Chasm and then replay it to reset the counters, I genuinely believe that Doodle would have won that game, but unfortunately, he completely forgot that he had already played a land when he went to go bounce the Glacial Chasm, so a little bit of a mistake, and I know that he thought that he was safe because he had multiple fogs in his hand, but I don't think he could have predicted Inferno getting all the way to 20 power kind of out of nowhere like that, so a little unfortunate, but still very cool to see Sarevok almost take down the win. And then, of course, last but not least, our deck. It did exactly what it wanted to do. It just played Regenerate creatures. Unfortunately, we didn't see a single board wipe the entire game. We really just couldn't find anything to deal with what our opponents were doing, which is unfortunate because that is a big part of our game plan. So we kind of just got unlucky and drew the wrong part of our deck. I think that if we'd been able to find a board wipe, we could have very easily regenerated all of our creatures. We would have set everybody back, and at that point in the game, most of our opponents had 0 cards in their hand, so I think we very easily could have won, especially because people had been knocked down pretty low at that point, but it just wasn't in the cards. We didn't quite get there, so overall, I had a ton of fun. I know my opponents did as well, and I hope everyone watching also had a good time. Please let me know down in the comments if there's any videos that you would like to see in the future, any cards you would like to see me build around. I love challenges. I love the cards that are maybe not the greatest cards in the world, but that people have special attachments to. So thank you all so much for watching. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.